no Nanny lasted a day with the prince's wild, motherless twins, until a quiet woman with no pedigree and a guarded past stepped through the gates of Highmoor. Without raising her voice, she unraveled their chaos, softened their grief, and awakened a long-silenced household. But as laughter returned to the halls, so did questions about her true reason for coming and the secret legacy that bound her to the family she was meant only to serve. What began as a post becomes a reckoning, and what began as duty becomes something dangerously close to love. The Somerset morning was wrapped in a veil of pale mist, heavy over the hills, silvering the treetops and softening the jagged stone walls that lined the long, winding road. The iron gates of Highmoor Castle stood tall, rusted at the joints and stubborn with disuse. As the horses pulled the modest black carriage forward, gravel crunched beneath the wheels like bone underfoot. A footman, shoulders hunched against the damp air, stepped forward to open the gates, though he barely glanced at the approaching vehicle. By now, the novelty of new arrivals had long since worn thin. Inside the carriage, Margaret Wells sat still, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. Her trunk had been loaded by the innkeeper that morning, her one good dress pressed and buttoned high at the throat. She wore her hair in a restrained coil, with no ribbon to brighten it. Her only adornment was a small pin on her collar, a silver thistle, the sort of token one might miss unless searching for it. The countryside slid past her window in a blur of grey and green, and the moment the carriage passed through the gates, the driver gave a low grunt and whipped the reins once, eager to deliver her quickly and retreat. As they crossed into the courtyard, the looming bulk of the castle emerged through the mist, its many chimneys exhaling faint smoke, its windows like hollow eyes peering down at the intruder. Margaret stepped out of the carriage without assistance, the hem of her traveling coat brushing against wet cobblestones. Her boots, scuffed but polished, made a soft tap as she walked toward the steps. She could feel the weight of unseen eyes behind the tall, mullioned glass. The front doors opened with a groan, and a tall, thin man with silver-streaked hair and a pinched expression stepped forward. His posture was rigid, every movement marked by restraint. He introduced himself as Mr. Holling, steward of the household, though his voice held none of the warmth usually afforded to greetings. In truth, it sounded more like a warning. "You are expected. His Highness will see you after you've settled in. Your quarters are prepared." Margaret inclined her head politely, but did not smile. There was little use in pleasantries when the air itself bristled with foregone conclusions. As she stepped into the entry hall, the door shut behind her with a hollow thud. The interior of the castle was no less imposing than its facade. High ceilings arched overhead, supported by ancient beams darkened with age. Tapestries hung from the stone walls, their threads frayed, their once vivid colors now dulled. A faint scent of wax, damp earth and ash lingered in the air, as though time itself had settled in the corners and refused to move on. Footsteps echoed, hers and Mr. Holling's, as they crossed the checkered marble floor. As they passed the dining hall, a serving maid peered through a half-open door, her face pale and apprehensive. She vanished the moment Margaret's gaze met hers. Further on, a young footboy appeared briefly at the top of a staircase, only to retreat behind a pillar when noticed. Whispers followed Margaret through the corridors like a breeze, never spoken aloud, only felt. The chamber prepared for her was modest, a narrow room on the third floor with a single bed, a tall window overlooking the mist-drenched gardens, and a small hearth where a low fire flickered uncertainly. Her trunk had already been placed at the foot of the bed. A washstand and a wooden wardrobe completed the furnishings, all clean, though stripped of comfort. There were no flowers, no books, no personal touches. This was not a room meant for belonging. It was a waiting room for failure. She was still removing her gloves when a knock came at the door. "His Highness will receive you now," Mr. Holling said, appearing in the doorway with the same grim expression. Margaret followed him without protest, her footsteps measured, her shoulders straight. The corridor turned sharply, and they descended a smaller staircase to the eastern wing, where the corridors grew darker, and the light from the windows fell in broken shards across the floors. Portraits of past Wessex ancestors lined the walls, each gaze more severe than the last. The prince's study was at the end of the hall, a large high-ceilinged chamber with tall windows curtained in heavy velvet and books lining the walls in tight, organized rows. The hearth roared with fire, though the air remained cool. The scent of leather, smoke, and ink hung thick in the room. Prince Lionel of Wessex stood near the hearth, tall and still, his profile marked by a strong, aristocratic line and an expression carved from stone. He did not extend his hand nor offer a chair. The light caught the gold pin on his lapel, a crest that had once commanded awe, but now seemed dulled with disuse. "So," he said, voice low but precise, "you're the 24th. She did not flinch. "Margaret Wells, Your Highness." He studied her with the detached scrutiny one might reserve for livestock. "You understand the situation?" "I understand that the children have not taken to prior supervision." "That's diplomatic." He moved to the desk and picked up a paper, the letter of recommendation from Reverend Withers. "It says here that you taught in a parish school, that you're capable of managing difficult temperaments." "I am." His gaze sharpened. "You'll find this position exceeds the usual definition of difficult. I don't scare easily." That brought a flicker of something. Not amusement, not approval. Curiosity, perhaps, or the barest note of surprise. He walked slowly toward the tall windows but did not look out. "You'll be given the day. They've never lasted longer than that." Margaret said nothing. She didn't ask what had happened to the others. The answer was already written in every corner of the house, in the broken vase at the base of the staircase, in the stains on the carpet, in the silent dread that surrounded the very mention of the children. Lionel turned his head slightly. "They're upstairs, East Wing Nursery. You'll find them in their usual state." With that, he gestured to Mr. Holling, who opened the door once more. Margaret gave a small, deliberate nod and turned to leave. The moment the door closed behind her, she heard it. A sudden thump from above, a scuffle, and a faint, unmistakable laugh. It rang through the stone like the peal of a bell in an empty chapel. She paused, listening. Then came a second sound, sharper this time, a short, violent crack, like the snap of rope or a loosened beam. She stepped forward, eyes lifting instinctively to the ceiling. Before Mr. Holling could utter a word, there was a rush of displaced air, and a heavy tapestry dropped from the far wall, its hooks torn clean from the stone. Dust exploded into the room as the fabric crumpled to the floor in a massive heap. Margaret took 2 steps back, her gaze darting upward. Someone, had moved across the rafters. She looked at Mr. Holling, who had gone white, and then she heard it again, a burst of high, wild laughter, muffled by the ceiling. She turned without a word and started toward the stairs, her skirts sweeping behind her as she broke into a swift, purposeful stride. The prince's voice called her name, sharp and commanding, but she didn't stop. She could still hear them, the children, the sound of something tipping, a crash, and then a breathless squeal of delight that cut short. A second later, something heavy fell upstairs. The stairwell twisted upward in a steep, narrow spiral, the stone steps worn down in the center from centuries of climbing feet. Margaret gripped the rail, the cool iron biting through her gloves as she ascended, the sounds above growing louder, scuffling, dragging, a screech of wood against stone. The scent changed as she climbed, shifting from the wax-polished air of the lower levels to something more chaotic, soot, ink, something sweet and rotting like forgotten fruit. She reached the landing and paused, her breath steady, listening. The corridor was chaos. Curtains had been ripped down and now trailed across the floor like abandoned gowns. Feathers scattered from burst pillows hung in the air, drifting slowly to the ground. A broom lay snapped in half near a doorway, and there were muddy boot prints, too small to be adult, marching in dizzying loops across the floorboards. From somewhere to the right came a high-pitched giggle, followed by the unmistakable splash of water. At the far end of the hallway, a door banged against the wall with rhythmic repetition, caught by the wind or by a mischievous hand. Margaret moved forward, silent despite her boots. She passed a window whose panes had been smudged with what looked like jam and ash. A child's drawing, done in bright red chalk, marked the wall beside it, a crown with horns and a tiny stick figure kneeling beneath it. Her eyes narrowed, but she kept walking, tracking the sound of movement to a set of double doors, partially open. The nursery. She stepped inside and stopped. The room was enormous. High ceilings and tall windows gave it the bones of a ballroom, but it had long ago been claimed by untamed childhood. Toys were scattered in every direction. Battered tin soldiers, cloth dolls with missing limbs, overturned chessboards, broken quills, and dozens of pages torn from books and fluttering in the air like wounded birds. A rocking horse had been tied with ribbons and left suspended between two wardrobes, swinging in the breeze from an open window. And there, high above the doorframe, crouched a boy no older than 7, his bare feet braced against the carved wood, his hair a tangle of gold curls gone wild with dust. Edward. He held a candlestick in one hand, not lit, thankfully, and a smudge of soot streaked his left cheek. His eyes, large and slate-grey, were fixed on her with something between mischief and disbelief. On the opposite side of the room, hidden partly behind a trunk, a little girl sat cross-legged on the floor, her skirt smeared with something sticky and violet. Eliza, with the same fair hair as her brother, though hers was braided into something that had clearly begun the day as neat. She clutched a feather duster like a sword and eyed Margaret like a cat, watching a dog through a narrow gap in a fence. They were both silent now, waiting. Margaret crossed the threshold and closed the door softly behind her. She made no sudden moves, no barked commands. She looked at the boy on the doorframe, then at the girl beside the trunk. Neither child spoke. With unhurried calm, Margaret stepped forward into the wreckage of the nursery and lowered herself to the floor, her skirts fanning around her knees as she sat cross-legged in the center of the chaos. The silence grew heavier, tighter. Edward shifted slightly on his perch. Eliza glanced at her brother, then back at the stranger who had dared to sit. Margaret spoke then, her voice even and low, as if reciting a memory. Once upon a time, in a kingdom where the walls had ears and the shadows never slept, there lived 2 children, a prince and a princess, who had made it their life's mission to drive every adult in the castle mad. Neither child reacted visibly, but neither looked away. They filled bathtubs with treacle. They replaced the cook's flour with lime. They filled the Lord Chancellor's boots with frogs. And they laughed. Oh, how they laughed. Eliza edged closer by a fraction, her feather sword lowered. But one day, Margaret continued, reaching into her pocket and retrieving a handkerchief, they heard a sound they'd never heard before. A knock. Not loud, not threatening. Just 3 soft taps on the nursery door. Tap, tap, tap. She tapped the floor beside her, very gently. Edward's feet shifted again. And behind the door stood a woman who didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't cry. She just looked at them very calmly and said, "Tell me your names." Margaret looked up, her gaze steady. "Now, shall we begin again?" Edward dropped from the doorframe in a single leap, landing on the balls of his feet with practiced ease. He walked in a wide arc around her, circling once before stopping in front of her, tilting his head. "You're not yelling," he said at last. "No. Or crying." Should I be?" He scowled, unsure how to answer. Eliza had risen to her feet and now stood behind him, silent as a shadow. "Everyone else does," she said, almost defiantly. "I'm not everyone else." Silence stretched, and Margaret held it. Let it breathe. Let them feel it. The boy scratched his elbow, and the girl brushed a feather from her shoulder. "I think," Margaret said slowly, "that anyone clever enough to suspend a rocking horse with ribbon has a great deal of imagination. And a great deal of imagination," she added, "shouldn't be wasted on scaring maids." A beat passed. Edward shrugged. "They're easy to scare." "I'm not." He considered this, then plopped down on the floor in front of her, crossing his legs to mirror her position. Eliza, slightly more cautious, remained standing, but her expression had shifted from suspicion to curiosity. Margaret reached into her satchel and removed a small cloth bundle. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing a single honey biscuit, perfectly round. She set it on the floor between them without a word. Edward eyed it with a thief's caution, then snatched it up and took a bite. "Do you know any more stories?" he asked, his mouth full. "Thousands." "Tell one." "I will, after we clean." Eliza frowned. "Clean what?" Margaret looked around the room with calm eyes. "Everything." Edward snorted. "You're mad." "Perhaps." She stood and extended a hand to the girl, who hesitated, then, in a small but unmistakable gesture, placed her palm in Margaret's. It was sticky. Margaret said nothing. In the hallway, the young chambermaid from earlier peeked through the door, her face pale. She froze in astonishment at the sight of Eliza holding the governess's hand and Edward trailing behind like a loyal cat. Within minutes, Margaret had fetched warm water in basins and found rags tucked into the wardrobe. She set about instructing the children how to scrub properly. No shrillness, no chastising. She worked beside them, showed them. They worked. Grumbling, yes, but they worked. By the time the worst of the feathers had been swept, Edward had begun asking questions. "Where are you from? Have you seen ghosts? Why do grown-ups always lie?" She answered what she could and deflected what she must. Eliza hummed to herself as she wiped the windows clean. When the bell rang below for the afternoon tea, Margaret suggested they wash their hands. Edward balked. "There's no point. No one lets us down to the tea room." "Then we'll make our own," she said. They trailed after her in disbelief as she led them to the small pantry adjoining the nursery, where a tray had already been delivered, untouched and forgotten by any adult who might have intervened. She uncovered the scones and arranged the cups with quiet efficiency. They sat at the low table, hands still damp from the wash basin, eating in stunned silence. It was the first peaceful hour the nursery had seen in months. But peace was always brief. When Margaret stood to collect the cups, Edward turned too quickly to say something and knocked the chair over. It hit the floor with a thud, and when he stepped back, his heel caught a loose plank. He fell with a shout, hands out, and vanished. The floor swallowed him whole. For one suspended moment, the world stilled. The teacups were still warm, crumbs still scattered across the linen cloth, but the chair Edward had knocked over lay on its side beside a jagged hole in the nursery floor. The planks fractured in a clumsy, splintered circle. Margaret dropped the cup she was holding. It shattered on the stone hearth as she lunged forward. Eliza screamed, sharp and high, her little hands clinging to the edge of the table. "Edward!" Margaret called, crouching beside the gaping opening. Dust swirled upward in a fine gray cloud. No answer came. She pressed her ear toward the hole, straining to hear. A scuffle, the scrape of fabric against stone, and then the unmistakable sound of movement below. Not panicked, but distant. "Edward," she said again, more sharply now. "Can you hear me?" His voice came faintly, as if buffered by thick walls. "I'm stuck." A rush of breath left her chest. He was conscious. Alive. She leaned down farther, peering into the dark. The light from the nursery didn't reach beyond the first few feet. A narrow shaft, built between the beams, led downward into blackness. Eliza crawled closer on her knees, her eyes wide with terror. "He fell in the tunnel," she whispered. "We didn't think it was real." "What tunnel?" "We heard about them. From the old gardener. But they said they were sealed off. From the war, or something." She was trembling now. "Is he bleeding?" Margaret reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a box of matches. Go find someone, the steward, a footman, anyone. Her tone left no room for delay. But now, Eliza. The girl fled, her feet bare, her curls flying behind her like a flame. Margaret didn't wait. She tugged off her overskirt in one motion and flung it aside. Beneath it, she wore stout boots and a second, simpler layer of wool. Her hands moved swiftly, unpinning her hair and tying it back with a strip of linen. Then she retrieved the oil lamp from the corner of the nursery, a dusty relic, but intact. She lit the wick, tested the strength of the glass, and approached the hole again. The edges of the opening were uneven, with splintered wood that had cracked inward. She dropped to her knees and lowered the lamp into the shaft, holding it by the hook. The light revealed a narrow, stony crawl space no more than 4 feet high, the walls lined with old masonry, and farther down, the brief flash of Edward's pale face. He was sitting upright, one leg twisted beneath him, his expression sullen but not frightened. "I can't move," he muttered, looking up at her. "My foot hurts." "I'm coming." Before she could doubt herself, Margaret swung her legs into the shaft and dropped the last few feet. The lantern's light wavered against the damp stones as she landed beside him. Her knees hit the floor hard, but she ignored the sting. Edward sat slumped against the wall, both hands braced behind him. His left boot was caught between 2 stones where the tunnel dipped slightly, and his ankle had twisted in the fall. "Let me see," she said quietly, lowering the lantern. He grimaced, but didn't argue. His face was pale beneath the grime, his curls matted with sweat. Margaret examined the ankle, her fingers quick and gentle. "No bones broken," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "But the joints badly wrenched. I've had worse." She raised an eyebrow but said nothing. With the ease of someone used to field work, she unwound the linen strip from her hair and fashioned a brace with the hem of her petticoat and 2 narrow slats of old wood that lay nearby, likely from collapsed paneling. As she wrapped the ankle, she felt his gaze on her. "You don't act like a governess," he said suddenly. "I've been many things." The tunnel groaned faintly, a sound like settling rock. Dust trickled from above. Margaret lifted the lantern and peered into the darkness. "How far do these tunnels go?" Edward shrugged. "We don't know. We thought they were for smugglers. They were likely escape routes. Castles used to have them during the old wars." She stood carefully, offering her hand. "Can you stand?" He took it without hesitation. "I think so." He winced as he put weight on the foot, but she supported him with her arm around his shoulders. The passage was just wide enough for them to walk side by side in a crouch. The damp air pressed in on them, and the stones underfoot were slick with moss. Somewhere ahead, water dripped rhythmically, echoing through the narrow space. "Do you know where this leads?" "Not really, but I think the kitchen, maybe." He pointed to the left. "That way smells like onions sometimes." "Then that's where we'll go." They walked slowly, her steps deliberate, his light and uneven. The tunnel curved, then narrowed again. On the walls, faint chalk markings appeared. Symbols, numbers, childish drawings. One of them was a name, Eliza, written in an uneven scrawl. Edward grinned at the sight. "She tried to map it last year, got scared and ran back, said she heard voices." Margaret kept walking. "She may have." "Do you believe in ghosts?" "No. But I believe in stories. And this place has too many of them." At the next turn, the tunnel widened into a small chamber, more a hollow than a room. Old crates lay stacked in the corner, rotted through, with ancient straw spilling from their sides. The air smelled of mildew and something older, a scent like forgotten time. Edward sank onto one of the crates, breathing heavily. His face had gone grey again. "We need to rest," she said, kneeling beside him. She offered him a flask from her coat, rainwater she'd gathered earlier in the day. He drank gratefully. As they rested, Margaret let the lantern's light move over the walls. She saw, tucked behind one of the crates, a half-covered painting in a broken frame. She pulled it free gently. Dust coated the canvas, but the image was still intact. A young woman with dark hair, seated at a pianoforte. The colors had faded to sepia and rust, but the expression on the woman's face was soft, familiar. Edward peered over her shoulder. "Who's she?" "I don't know." But something in her tone said otherwise. The moment passed. Edward shifted uncomfortably, his leg beginning to cramp. "Can we go now?" She nodded, setting the portrait back where it had been. It didn't belong to her. Not yet. They rose again, continuing down the tunnel as it began to slope upward. At last, they reached a wooden panel at the tunnel's end. Faint light glowed through its cracks. Margaret pressed her ear to it, hearing footsteps and the murmur of low voices. She knocked once. The panel jerked open from the outside, and bright lamplight spilled into the tunnel. A footman stared at her, mouth open. Behind him stood Mr. Holling, and further back, the prince. Margaret stepped forward, guiding Edward through the threshold. The boy was pale, filthy, and limping, but upright. The servants parted silently. The prince stood at the far end of the corridor, rigid as iron. His face was unreadable. Edward moved toward him without hesitation. Margaret followed more slowly, brushing dust from her skirt. The air felt warmer here, less stale, but not quite safe. Lionel's gaze flicked from Edward to her, then back again. She thought he might speak, but before he could, the corridor behind them darkened, and a servant approached, panting. "A rider," he said breathlessly. "From London." Lionel's jaw tightened. "From whom?" The footman held out a sealed envelope, trembling slightly. "The Queen, Your Highness. Direct orders." Margaret felt the chill long before Lionel broke the seal. Lionel broke the red wax seal with a sharp flick of his thumb, the crack of it loud in the hush that had fallen over the corridor. His expression did not change as he unfolded the letter, but Margaret noted the way his shoulders stiffened. The oil lamps lining the stone walls flickered, casting his silhouette in stark relief, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. He read in silence, line by line, eyes moving with a growing intensity that only those close to him might have recognized. When he finished, he folded the page once, carefully, and looked up. His face was calm, but the calm of a lake before a storm. "Mr. Holling," he said, voice low. "Have a guest chamber prepared for Miss Wells tonight." Margaret blinked, caught off guard. "She will remain at Highmore under formal authorization until further notice." Mr. Holling's brows rose faintly, but he offered no objection. He bowed and turned briskly to carry out the command. The footman with the Queen's letter retreated, taking with him the weight of whatever London intended. Lionel turned then to Edward. "You'll see the physician for that ankle." "I don't want—" "You'll go." Edward muttered something under his breath, but allowed himself to be led away. Margaret stood alone in the corridor as the others dispersed, the shadows deepening around her. The letter had not been addressed to her, but the aftershock of its presence still rang in her chest. Lionel didn't speak again until the corridor was empty. "You'll stay in the nursery quarters for now. There is no alternative." He looked at her briefly. "I would not have asked otherwise." Margaret inclined her head. "I understand, Your Highness." He hesitated for a moment as if expecting more. A protest, a question, something. But she remained still, composed. "Good," he said. He left her standing there, the folded letter still in his hand. The room assigned to her was on the floor just below the nursery, the same wing, though narrower, with lower ceilings and older furnishings. The chamber was sparse but clean, with a heavy oak wardrobe and a narrow bed dressed in fresh linens. A single oil lamp burned beside the hearth, throwing golden light across the floorboards. Her trunk had been placed by the wall, unopened. Margaret took off her boots and washed her hands at the basin, the water cold enough to sting. The copper pitcher clanged as she returned it to its tray. Outside the window, the sky had gone slate gray. Twilight was folding over the countryside, and somewhere in the distance, thunder murmured like a warning. She ate nothing that evening. A tray had been brought to her door with bread, soft cheese, and a slice of roasted chicken, but the food sat untouched on the small table by the window. Her appetite had been eclipsed by something harder to name. Not worry, not fear, expectation. After dressing in a plain nightgown, she took her shawl and moved quietly through the corridor. The castle had a stillness in the evening that unsettled the senses. Not the peace of rest, but the kind of hush that followed arguments and closed doors. She padded down the stone stairwell, avoiding the main halls. At the base of the western tower, a narrow door stood ajar, leading to one of the unused galleries. It was there she paused. The room was mostly dark, save for the faint glow of coals in the fireplace and the silvery light of the moon filtering through stained glass. She stepped inside, shutting the door behind her. A worn settee rested near the hearth, its cushions faded with time. A cabinet stood against the wall, locked. Dust covered most of the surfaces, though someone had recently cleared a path through it, a trail of disturbed motes glinting in the air. She crossed to the corner, where an abandoned writing desk faced the window. From the pocket of her shawl, she drew a small bundle wrapped in linen. Inside was a miniature portrait, its frame tarnished, the paint cracked at the corners. A woman's face looked back, dark hair parted in the center, soft brown eyes and a slight knowing smile. The likeness was faintly familiar, quietly radiant. Margaret placed the portrait on the desk and rested her fingers on its edge. She whispered a name. The fire crackled behind her, a coal shifting. She turned at the sound and saw him. Lionel stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, his expression unreadable in the low light. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He didn't ask what she was doing there. She didn't explain. Instead, he stepped inside and moved to the hearth. He stirred the fire with the poker, adding another log from the basket. The flames caught quickly, casting his features in motion, the hard lines of his cheekbones, the slope of his jaw, the faint shadow beneath his eyes. He looked like a man not accustomed to sleep. "I didn't think you'd still be awake," he said at last. "I don't sleep easily in unfamiliar rooms." A silence passed, heavy, but not uncomfortable. He glanced at the portrait. "Who is she?" Margaret paused. "My mother." He studied the image. "Was she an artist?" "No. It was painted by a man she once knew. He gave it to her before she left London." "Is she living?" "No." He gave a short nod, as though something about her reply answered a different question entirely. "I'll be leaving early in the morning," he said. "There's a matter that requires my attention in the southern village. I'll return by dusk. In the meantime, Holling will provide you with whatever you require." She didn't thank him. She didn't bow. She only nodded once. Lionel looked at her again, not the way a prince looks at a subject, but the way a man looks at a puzzle he cannot solve. "You do things differently," he said. "Yes," she replied. He stepped back into the doorway. "Let them sleep," he said. "Tomorrow we'll begin early." Then he was gone. Margaret waited until the sound of his steps had faded before retrieving the portrait and wrapping it carefully. She returned to her room, lay down on the narrow bed, and stared at the ceiling for a long time. At some hour past midnight, the castle creaked. Wind battered against the windows. Far off, a door slammed in the east wing, and in the nursery above her, the twins slept. The next morning brought a soft drizzle and low clouds that clung to the hills like gauze. Margaret dressed early, her hands moving by habit rather than thought. She braided her hair with precision, wrapped her shawl tight, and made her way upstairs. She found Eliza sitting on the windowsill, feet swinging idly, her gaze on the damp garden below. "Edward says you used to be a nurse," she said without turning. "Before you were a governess." "I've tended the sick." Eliza looked over her shoulder. "That's why you knew what to do with his foot." Margaret didn't answer. The girl hopped down and took her hand without asking. Breakfast was served in the nursery that morning: toast, eggs, and thin slices of ham. Edward was quiet but not sullen. He ate everything on his plate. The hours passed in a new rhythm. There were reading lessons and handwriting exercises, and even a short walk beneath the covered gallery when the rain lessened. The children no longer seemed to be testing her. They watched her instead, as if waiting to see whether she would disappear like the others. But she didn't. By afternoon, a hush had settled over the house. Margaret found herself alone near the library staircase while the children napped. The walls here were lined with towering shelves, and the scent of old leather and ink permeated the air. She drifted down the corridor, trailing one hand along the banister. Something glinted near the base of one of the bookshelves, a hinge cleverly hidden in the woodwork. She knelt and pulled gently. A volume slid forward with a soft click. A book fell from the shelf into her hands, older than the rest. Its pages crackled as she opened it. And there, between two chapters on estate law and household management, lay a letter, sealed and addressed to the former Duke of Wessex. The signature was written in elegant, unmistakable script: Catherine Wells. Lionel sat in the garden conservatory, surrounded by the scent of damp earth and the faint perfume of blooming lilies. The glass walls were streaked with mist, refracting the pale morning light into thin, shifting bands across the floor. He sat stiffly on the iron bench near the orange trees, arms folded, one boot tapping against the tile. The sound of footsteps reached him just before she entered. Margaret stood framed in the open archway, her shawl pulled tight across her shoulders. She stepped inside without hesitation, her expression composed but unreadable. There was a breeze between them, the kind that didn't stir leaves, but something else invisible and still. "You wanted to speak with me," she said. Lionel nodded, slowly unfolding his arms. "Walk with me." They moved through the narrow pathways between potted citrus trees and climbing roses, their steps nearly in unison. The conservatory was quiet, but for the occasional creak of the iron frame and the steady drip of water from the glass ceiling. Outside, the rain had stopped, though clouds still loomed over the hills. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "You were in the West Wing last night." She didn't deny it. "I was. That wing is closed for a reason. I found it open." Lionel's jaw tightened. "That part of the house was my mother's." Margaret didn't respond. Her silence was neither apologetic nor defensive. It simply waited. After a long pause, he stopped walking. His gaze swept across the room and landed on her with quiet force. "Why were you there?" She met his eyes. "Because I wanted to understand this place. I can't care for the children properly if I don't know the spaces they inhabit. Or the ones they avoid." Lionel considered that. "You found something?" "I did." Her voice softened, but it didn't waver. A portrait. And an atmosphere so thick with sorrow it felt like a second skin. He studied her, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. "That was her room," he said after a moment. "My wife's." Margaret exhaled slowly. "I'm sorry." He nodded once, as if to say the apology wasn't necessary, but accepted just the same. A breath passed between them. "They never speak of her," she added gently. "The children." "No." He looked away. "I've never known how to speak of her to them. They've grown up in silence," she said. "They've made a kingdom out of it." Lionel's shoulders tensed. It wasn't meant to be silence, but it became one. The truth settled between them, heavy and inescapable. The prince folded his arms again, a defensive gesture cloaked in ease. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower. "They ask questions," he murmured. "You wouldn't believe how many questions they have, especially Eliza. And I never seem to have the right answers." "Children rarely want the answers," Margaret said. "Only the honesty." That made him look at her again, directly, sharply. "I don't know if I'm capable of that," he admitted. She smiled, faintly. "Then start with one truth." He didn't reply. Instead, he turned and resumed walking, slower now, The edge softened. Later that day, the routine continued as if nothing had passed between them. Margaret returned to the nursery. The children greeted her with stories. Eliza had tried to braid Edward's hair, and he'd retaliated by hiding her shoes in the firewood pile. There was no scolding, only learning. In the afternoon, they walked the outer grounds beneath their cloaks. The wind smelled of wet grass and turned soil, and the sky hung low above the treetops, as if waiting to fall. Margaret taught them the names of the birds they heard, the difference between lichen and moss, and how to follow a rabbit trail without disturbing it. Edward limped only slightly, and Eliza clung to Margaret's hand with the ease of someone who no longer had to question safety. Lionel watched from the upper window of the library. His hand rested lightly on the glass, but he made no move to open it. The pages of the book on his desk fluttered behind him, forgotten. That evening, the castle fell into a hush. Fires were lit. The wind picked up. Shadows grew long across the stone corridors, and Margaret returned to the library. The letter still lay where she had left it, tucked between the pages of a crumbling volume. The seal was cracked, but not broken. Her fingers hovered over it. She knew the name. She knew the way her mother had signed it, with a slight upward curl on the final S, as though still holding something back. She opened the letter slowly, with care. The parchment was yellowed, the ink faded but legible. My lord, I have done what I was asked. I cared for her with all the tenderness I could offer. But you were wrong to think she would not understand what was being denied her. She is not blind. Nor am I. When I leave Highmoor, it will not be of my own volition. I do not seek mercy, only acknowledgement. If not for myself, then for her. She bears your name, though you never gave it to her. Catherine Wells. Margaret closed her eyes. She folded the letter carefully and slid it into the pocket of her dress. She didn't move for a long while. The fire crackled. The wind howled softly beyond the windows. When she left the library, she walked slowly, her hand clenched at her side. Her steps took her through the familiar corridor, past the drawing room toward the nursery, but when she reached the door, she paused. Something in the air had shifted. There was laughter inside. Not loud, soft, fluttering, like the bell of a flower opening. The kind that came from comfort. And something else. A warmth that didn't come from the hearth. Margaret stepped in quietly. The children sat cross-legged on the rug, a game of pick-up stones spread out between them. Lionel was seated on the floor beside them, his sleeves rolled up, his posture relaxed in a way she hadn't seen before. He looked up when she entered, and the flicker of something unguarded passed between them. She nodded once. He nodded back. That night, the castle did not feel quite as heavy. She slept without dreams. Until the bell rang. The sharp chime cut through the silence just before dawn. Margaret sat upright, heart pounding, already reaching for her robe. She opened her door into the corridor just as a footman came rushing toward her. "Your presence is requested," he said breathlessly. "Immediately." "What's happened?" He didn't answer. She followed him through the corridor, down the main staircase, past the front hall where cold air seeped in from the edges of the doorframe. Lionel stood in the entryway, still in shirt sleeves, hair disheveled. In his hand, he held an envelope, another seal, another letter. He looked at her, but this time his expression held something more than tension. He stepped toward her. "I need to ask you something," he said, quiet but urgent. Margaret stiffened. "Yes?" "Your mother's name," he said. "Say it again." "Catherine Wells." He stared at the letter. Then he lifted it slowly, unfolding the contents before her. "She wrote to my father," he murmured. "The Duke." And he read the final line aloud, the words dry in his mouth. "She bears your name." He looked up, his gaze piercing. "Wells," he repeated. "But my uncle's name was Edward." The name hung in the air like the toll of a distant bell, echoing with implications not yet spoken aloud. Margaret stood very still, her hand clenched gently around the edge of her shawl. Edward. The name, ordinary and common in sound, meant nothing until Lionel said it again, not in a question, but as a thread leading back through years, through walls, through shadows still thick in the corridors of Highmore. My uncle, Lionel repeated, quieter now, as though unsure of the ground beneath his feet. Edward de Wessex. He lived here. Years ago. He left after a dispute with my father and was never spoken of again. Margaret's breath caught, too shallow. She did not lower her gaze, though her pulse pounded in her ears. I don't remember him, Lionel said, eyes still fixed on her. Only what my mother used to say, that he was trouble, a disappointment. Too warm-hearted for court and too foolish for war. The wind pushed against the high windows in a long, plaintive sigh. The corridor had grown colder. She never spoke of him after he left, Lionel continued, almost to himself. But now I find this. He held up the letter from Catherine again, the parchment trembling faintly in his grip. And you. Margaret's voice was calm, but there was tension in it. The tight rope of restraint pulled taut. I never knew the name of my father. My mother didn't speak it. She only said we had once belonged to a house of stone and silence. Lionel looked at her closely, as if searching for the answer not in her words, but in her face. For a moment, neither moved. Somewhere in the hall above, footsteps echoed. Perhaps a servant, perhaps one of the children, but neither turned their heads. Finally, Lionel folded the letter with slow precision and slipped it back into the envelope. We don't know anything yet, he said. No, Margaret replied, only that the silence runs deeper than we thought. The morning passed without incident, though a current of unease threaded through the household. The grooms walked more briskly across the stables, and the maids spoke in hushed tones. Word had not spread, but Highmore had always been a place that sensed things before they were said. And today, it bristled. Margaret remained in the nursery until midday, overseeing the children's reading lessons and watching Edward closely. His ankle was healing, though he still limped slightly. He sat sprawled on the rug, frowning over a Latin primer, while Eliza used the time to steal pieces of hard biscuit from the tea tray. They say the Queen writes to Father, Eliza remarked suddenly. Is it because of you? Margaret didn't answer immediately. She walked to the window and looked out. The rain had returned in a thin drizzle, coating the glass like breath. The Queen wants to know that you're well cared for, she said at last. But she doesn't know you, Eliza replied. She doesn't know if we like you or not. Do you? Edward looked up, startled by the question. Eliza tilted her head, thoughtful. We didn't, she admitted. But we do now. Margaret turned from the window. Then perhaps you'll tell her that if she asks. Later, as the children rested in their room, Margaret walked the corridors alone. The quiet had grown heavier since the letter, not just in her, but in the house itself. Each footstep seemed to echo longer. Each closed door felt less like protection and more like concealment. She found herself drawn to the old chapel wing, now disused. Dust covered the pews in a fine, unbroken film. The air was colder there, untouched by hearth or candle. At the far end stood a marble altar, and above it, a stained glass window half obscured by ivy. She sat on the edge of a pew, letting the silence settle around her. She pulled the letter from her pocket. Catherine's words were brief, but they held an ache that no passage of time had dimmed. There was no claim, no demand. Only the quiet insistence that a child should not be forgotten, that love, even misplaced, still deserved its name. The echo of Lionel's voice returned to her then. Edward de Wessex, the black sheep, the one sent away. Was that who her mother had loved? Was that the name her mother had whispered at night when no one was listening? She heard movement behind her, the soft creak of a floorboard. She turned. It was Lionel. He stood just inside the doorway, coat unbuttoned, his eyes shadowed beneath his brow. "I thought I might find you here," he said. Margaret didn't speak. She let him come closer until the dust stirred around his boots. "I looked through the family ledgers," he said. "The old ones." Her heart picked up. There was mention of Edward. He spent his summers here, played the pianoforte, rode in the orchard, argued constantly with my father. And then in 1846, there's a note beside his name. Dismissed to travel abroad. Unfit for court service. No further stipend approved. "That's the year I was born," Margaret said. Lionel nodded. "The last record of him is a letter from Paris, and then nothing." The silence lingered. "My mother was in service at Highmore that year," she said. "Assigned to the Dowager Duchess." "I know." Lionel looked away for a moment, then back. His voice lowered. "If he is your father." She met his gaze, steady. "Then I have Wessex blood." He didn't deny it. They stood facing one another in the still air of the chapel, beneath the faded saints and forgotten prayers. The light through the stained glass dappled their skin in muted color. "I don't want anything," she said quietly. "No claim. No favor. I believe you. I only want the truth." "I do too." Another breath passed between them. "You changed this place," Lionel said, softer now. "You made it breathe again." "I didn't come to change anything. I only came to do what I was asked." He shook his head slowly. "You came because you belonged here, even if none of us saw it." They did not touch, nor move closer. But something invisible shifted between them, a thread pulled taut, no longer strained, but waiting. That evening, the air thickened. A storm rolled over the hills, slow and heavy, pressing against the sky. Thunder growled across the moors, low and constant, like a lion just beneath the surface of the earth. The children were restless. Eliza refused to sleep in her bed and insisted on curling up on the rug near the hearth. Edward followed without protest. Margaret tucked a blanket around them both and remained near, seated in the armchair with a book she never opened. The storm deepened. Rain lashed against the windows. The castle creaked, old bones stirring. She did not sleep that night. At dawn, she went to her window. The storm had passed, leaving the grounds soaked and silvered with morning light. Mist clung to the hedges and drifted over the gravel paths like breath. Somewhere in the orchard, birds began to call, uncertain and slow. She dressed and left the nursery quietly. Lionel was already awake. She found him in the great hall, standing before the cold hearth with a folded page in his hand. "A summons has come," he said, not turning. "From Bath. A gathering. Political, but dressed in ceremony. The Queen has insisted I attend." Margaret waited. "She has also insisted the children accompany me." He turned then, his eyes on hers. "And you?" Her brows lifted. "They wish to observe the situation," he said bitterly. "To determine if the household is stable, if I am." She studied him, the tension in his shoulders, the calculation behind his steady voice. "Do you intend to go?" He nodded. "I have no choice." "And do you intend to bring me?" He paused. "Yes." Margaret folded her hands. "Then I will come." A beat passed. Lionel stepped close. "There will be eyes on us. There always are." The quiet stretched. Then he held out the folded. She took it and read. A formal invitation. Royal seal. No room for... When she looked up, Lionel's expression had changed. There was something else behind his gaze now. Something unspoken, urgent, and fragile. But before he could speak, a servant burst through the door, soaked with rain. "A message, Your Highness," the man said, breathless. "From Bath. Sir Reginald Markham is on the guest list." Margaret's blood turned to ice. The name echoed through the stone hall like the first crack of ice across a frozen lake. Sir Reginald Markham. Margaret said nothing. Her expression remained composed, almost eerily so, but Lionel saw something shift behind her eyes, a flash of cold recognition, quickly buried. Her hands stayed at her sides, her posture unchanged. yet the air around her altered, as though an unseen door had slammed shut. The servant, drenched and shivering, still stood at the threshold of the room. Lionel dismissed him with a nod, barely glancing his way. The man bowed and retreated, boots squeaking across the wet stone, the door closing with a final thud behind him. Silence fell. Lionel didn't ask. He waited. Margaret's gaze drifted toward the window. Beyond it, the mist was beginning to lift, rising from the grass in pale ribbons. The morning had turned from silver to pewter. Still, she didn't speak. Only when Lionel stepped toward her did she finally say, very quietly, "I hadn't heard his name in years." He paused. "You know him?" It wasn't a question. "Yes." The word left her mouth like a stone sinking through water. She didn't elaborate. Instead, she turned away and moved toward the fireplace, where a low flame had been coaxed into life by one of the early servants. Her fingers hovered over the warmth, not seeking heat but stillness. Lionel didn't press her, but his tone lost its earlier coolness. "Will his presence be a problem?" Margaret's eyes closed for a moment. "Only if he recognizes me." The tension in the room drew tight, taut as piano wire. Lionel stepped beside her, watching her face in profile. How calm she appeared, how still. But there was something tightly coiled just beneath the surface. He recognized it. He'd seen it in men before battle, in women burying grief with grace. He lowered his voice. "I won't let him near the children." She turned to him then, meeting his eyes squarely. "It isn't the children I'm worried about." The journey to Bath began the following morning. The rain had broken during the night, and the roads, though slick, were passable. The royal carriage arrived at Highmoor just after dawn, its gleaming wheels and polished brass lanterns looking too fine for the muddied countryside. A second, smaller coach was sent for the servants and the children's things. Lionel wore a dark traveling coat and gloves, his expression unreadable beneath the high collar. The twins were dressed neatly in matching navy wool, with Edward protesting the extra layers and Eliza trying not to wrinkle the ribbons at her wrists. They were giddy, despite the hour, and asked a dozen questions as the bags were loaded. Margaret oversaw their packing with methodical calm, though her gaze strayed to the distant hills more than once. As she settled into the rear-facing seat beside the children, Lionel took his place opposite her, legs braced, arms folded. The coach lurched forward, and the gravel of the Highmoor Drive gave way to the narrow county road, still veiled in damp fog. For the first hour, the children chatted restlessly, pointing at sheep and counting every milestone. But eventually they quieted, lulled by the rhythm of the wheels and the swaying of the carriage. Edward dozed against Margaret's arm, and Eliza leaned against the window, her breath fogging the glass. Lionel watched them both, then turned his attention to Margaret. "Tell me now," he said quietly, "before we arrive. What should I know?" Her eyes flickered open. She had not been resting, only pretending to, her thoughts far away. "Sir Reginald Markham," she said slowly, "was once a friend of my mother's employers in London, a man of considerable influence and little patience. He visited often. He was fond of gifts, trinkets, chocolates, toys." Lionel's brow furrowed. "I was a child," she said, her voice steady. 10, perhaps 11. He said I reminded him of someone he once loved. Lionel didn't move. "He never touched me," she added quickly. "But he watched. He asked questions, left notes. My mother insisted I stop serving tea in the drawing room when he was present. After that, she left the house entirely. We came west, to Somerset. And he hasn't seen you since?" "Not to my knowledge." Lionel's jaw worked slightly. "If he recognizes you, he won't. I was a child, and he thinks of children as forgettable things." Silence fell again, heavier than before. The city of Bath emerged around midday, rising through the mist like a painting come to life. Its sandstone buildings golden even under the dull sky, their Georgian lines pristine, elegant, indifferent to the muddied wheels of a country carriage. The town pulsed with energy, servants and tradesmen weaving through horse-drawn cabs, ladies in heavy cloaks sweeping through market squares. The windows glimmered with candlelight and polished glass. Their party was met by a steward from the Queen's household, who directed them to a townhouse near the Royal Crescent, stately but reserved, meant for temporary stays. Inside, the air was warm, the furnishings fine but impersonal. Everything had the sheen of formality, of inspection. Margaret and the children were shown to a set of adjoining chambers on the second floor, overlooking a narrow garden. Lionel was housed in the room across the hall, as protocol demanded. By the time they'd arrived and settled, the daylight had begun to shift into its gentler, duskier tones. At 6 o'clock sharp, they were expected at a reception hosted by the Duchess of Avonmere on behalf of the Queen. It was understood that the Queen herself might appear, though not announced. The Duchess's house was only a few streets away, and the children were not expected to attend. As the hour approached, Margaret dressed quietly. She wore her only formal gown, slate blue wool with simple embroidery at the hem, high-necked and fitted at the waist. Her gloves were clean but worn, and she brushed a crease from her sleeve with careful fingers. She heard a knock at her chamber door and opened it to find Lionel, already dressed. His coat was deep grey, tailored and precise, his cravat pinned with a modest pearl. He didn't stare, only looked. "You're ready," he said. "Yes." "Come then." The Duchess's home was a flurry of music and candlelight, the warmth from the chandeliers unable to erase the cold formality beneath the polite laughter. Guests mingled with practiced grace, servants moving like clockwork through the rooms with trays of champagne and sugared almonds. Lionel was greeted with appropriate reverence, though eyes lingered longer than they should on his companion. Margaret did not flinch under the stares. She stood beside him with composed poise, answering only when addressed, allowing Lionel to guide the conversation as needed. More than once, she caught a whisper exchanged behind gloved fingers. It was not until the second hour that she saw him. Sir Reginald Markham. He was older now, of course, thicker at the waist, thinner at the crown, but his voice hadn't changed, still smooth, practiced, coaxing. He stood beneath a gilded mirror, holding court with a group of younger men, gesturing with a glass of brandy. The moment her eyes landed on him, she turned her face slightly, shifting her posture. But it was too late. He had seen her. His gaze caught, lingered, narrowed. She turned to Lionel, her voice low. "He's here." "I see him." Sir Reginald murmured something to the men around him and stepped away. He crossed the floor with the ease of someone used to power, weaving through the crowd like silk through fingers. He stopped several paces from them, his eyes sharp now, almost gleaming. "Your Highness," he said with a courteous bow, "and this lovely creature must be Miss Wells. A pleasure. I've heard so much." Lionel's hand twitched slightly at his side. "Sir Reginald," Margaret inclined her head. "Sir." "Forgive me," Reginald said, eyes on her. "But have we met?" She shook her head. "I don't believe so." "Curious." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Your face has a certain familiarity. I have an eye for faces, especially memorable ones." Lionel stepped closer, his presence suddenly larger. "Miss Wells is under my protection." "Of course," Reginald said easily. "Of course. A fortunate position." He lingered 1 second too long before bowing again. Then he turned and vanished into the crowd. Margaret didn't exhale until Lionel gently touched her elbow. "We're leaving," he said. They didn't speak on the walk back to the townhouse, but once they'd returned and the door had closed behind them, Lionel removed his gloves slowly, deliberately. "I want to know," he said. Margaret nodded, her voice quiet. "Then I will tell you." They sat in the small drawing room, the fire burning low, its warmth modest. The room smelled faintly of lavender and coal. Outside, the rain had begun again, misting the windows. And in that low-lit silence, she told him everything. When she finished, Lionel stood. He didn't speak. He crossed the room, poured 2 glasses of water and handed her one. His hand brushed hers as he did. Margaret took the glass with steady fingers. Neither of them noticed the footman at the doorway until he cleared his throat softly. "Apologies," the man said, eyes cast down. "But the Queen's steward has arrived. He's requested to see Miss Wells." Margaret stood, heart knocking against her ribs. The footman opened the door farther. The steward was waiting just beyond the threshold. "You've been summoned," he said with perfect calm. "The Queen will receive you now." Margaret followed the steward through a narrow corridor lit only by wall sconces and the flicker of a single oil lamp. The hush in the passage was deep, unbroken, and the further they walked, the more distant the sounds of the reception became, the faint music, the laughter, the clinking of crystal, until all of it fell away. Her hands were folded before her, her gloves still on. She had not taken a moment to collect herself. There had been no time. Lionel had offered her a single, unreadable look before she stepped past him, and now he remained behind, out of reach. At the end of the corridor, a door opened onto a modest salon, delicate in proportion, with damask-covered walls and a fireplace already burning low. The ceiling was painted in soft hues of rose and cream, and the air smelled of fresh ink and faint lavender. A secretary stood beside a writing desk, sorting correspondence in silence, and gave no notice to her entrance. The steward motioned once, then retreated without another word, the door shutting behind him. She was not alone. Seated in a high-backed chair near the hearth was a woman in a gown of deepest burgundy, her posture regal without effort, her hands resting lightly on the carved wooden arms of the chair. Her hair, braided and wound beneath a black netted cap, was streaked with silver at the temples, and her face bore the marks of a life lived in close proximity to power, serenity forged by responsibility, not ease. The Queen of England did not rise, but she looked directly at Margaret. There was no mistaking the authority in her eyes. It was not the authority of politics alone, but of a woman who had spent her life reading people before they had even spoken. Margaret curtsied. "Miss Wells," the Queen said, in a voice neither cold nor warm. "Please sit." A single chair had been placed at a modest angle to the Queen's own. Margaret took it, smoothing her skirts carefully before lifting her chin. "I am not fond of disruption," the Queen continued, "but I am aware that sometimes it is necessary." Margaret said nothing. "I've received conflicting reports regarding your arrival at Highmoor, your conduct in the nursery, and the unusual improvement in the children's behavior since your engagement. I imagine they were very conflicting, Your Majesty." "They were." The Queen gave a faint, dry smile. "One said you bewitched the children. Another claimed you bribed them with sweets and ghost stories. I suspect the truth is more ordinary." "I didn't bribe them." "No. I doubt you needed to." Her gaze sharpened. "They like you. They're remarkable children. That's not the same as easy children." "No, Your Majesty." The Queen leaned back, fingertips together. "Their father has not made things easy either." Margaret didn't allow herself even a flicker of expression. The Queen went on, her tone contemplative. "Lionel has been adrift since his wife's death. You may know this, or perhaps you've sensed it. He hasn't been a man of action for some time, but since your arrival, the Crown has observed—" Here she paused with meaning. "Changes." Margaret's voice was soft. "I don't pretend to understand the politics behind what you observe, but I do understand grief and silence, and how easily both can become habits." The Queen tilted her head. "That is the sort of insight one does not expect from a governess." "I'm not certain I ever was one." Silence fell between them, thick and uneasy. "You've attracted attention," the Queen said. "I suspected as much. Not all of it favorable. Your family history, or lack thereof, has stirred questions. And your surname, an unfortunate coincidence." Margaret's hands curled slightly in her lap. It is not a coincidence. The Queen's eyes narrowed. My mother served at Highmore, Margaret said, her voice low but clear. She was dismissed under circumstances no one seems able to explain. She gave birth shortly after. She raised me alone. She never spoke of the father. And you believe that man was Edward de Wessex? I don't know what to believe. Only that she wrote a letter to the Duke, and he never answered. The Queen rose then, not abruptly, but with the slow grace of a woman used to moving beneath the weight of expectation. She walked to the desk and opened a drawer. From it, she withdrew a folded sheet, familiar in size and thickness. I've read the letter, she said. Margaret looked up. It was filed, poorly, hidden among estate complaints and petitions from minor peers, but I found it. She turned, holding the paper loosely. She asked for nothing, no money, no title, only acknowledgement. I know. The Queen studied her for a moment, then returned to her seat and laid the letter on her lap. She could have demanded far more. Her restraint is rare. Margaret's voice was steady. She had her pride. The Queen nodded once. And now you are here. I came to work. You came for more than that. Margaret looked away. Not at first. You love the children. Yes. You're not here for favor? No. Not even for Lionel? The question landed with too much force to deflect. Margaret lifted her gaze. He never asked me for anything. He gave me nothing to chase. But yes, I care for him. The Queen was silent. Then she said, You're not the only one watching him. I know. Sir Reginald is no friend to your cause. Margaret's breath hitched. He recognized me? The Queen's voice cooled. He believes he did. But even he is not arrogant enough to make accusations without proof. Margaret exhaled slowly. I will not allow him to interfere, the Queen said. Margaret looked at her in surprise. Why? Because I prefer children raised by someone who knows how to speak the truth. And because Lionel has been useful to me in the past, and maybe again. There was a pause. But more than that, the Queen added quietly, because your mother deserved an answer. The words moved through Margaret like heat after cold. She felt the tightness in her throat, the sting in her chest, but said nothing. The Queen glanced at the door. You'll remain in Bath with the family until I give further instruction. After the reception tomorrow, there will be a review of the household's conduct. Your presence is expected. Margaret stood. Yes, Your Majesty. The Queen gave a single nod. You may go. Margaret curtsied once more, carefully, and turned toward the door. But just as she reached for the handle, the Queen's voice stopped her. Miss Wells. She turned. Tell the Prince he will not receive a second chance at this. I will. Margaret left the salon, the letter still burning in her mind. The steward waited for her in the corridor, silent as a shadow, and led her back through the house. She walked more slowly now, her thoughts too full. When she reached the townhouse, the children had already been put to bed, and Lionel waited for her in the drawing room. The fire was low, the curtains drawn, and the room smelled faintly of brandy and books. He rose when she entered. Well? He asked. She gave him the faintest of smiles. She read the letter. He closed his eyes briefly. And? She's not your enemy. He let out a slow breath. But not our ally either. She's watching. Lionel crossed to her slowly. And Markham? She knows. His hands curled at his sides. If he speaks again, she won't let him. Lionel looked at her closely then, as if seeing something new. What did she ask of you? She asked for nothing, Margaret said. Only that I be ready. He nodded once, the movement tight. Outside, the wind had begun to rise again. The fire crackled behind them. Neither moved. Then came a knock at the townhouse door. A servant answered, and a moment later returned with a sealed envelope. Lionel broke the wax and read silently. When he looked up, his face had gone still. "The Queen has summoned us again," he said. Margaret frowned. "Now?" "No." He met her eyes. "Tomorrow, and she expects the children to attend." Margaret's pulse quickened. "Why?" Lionel handed her the note. At the bottom, written in the Queen's unmistakable hand, were 5 words. "She bears your name as well." Morning light crept gently over Bath, casting a soft golden hue on the crescent-shaped terraces and dew-laced gardens. A veil of mist still lingered low over the cobbled streets, but the air had the clarity that followed heavy rain, washed clean and hushed by the storm. In the guest townhouse, servants moved with quiet efficiency, preparing wardrobes, polishing boots, straightening cravats and lace cuffs. There was no room for delay today, not with the Queen herself expecting them. In the nursery chambers, Margaret helped Eliza fasten the final pearl button on her pinafore, then bent to smooth a stray curl from the girl's brow. Eliza looked up at her with steady eyes, old beyond their years. "Do we have to be perfect?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Margaret's hand stilled for a moment. "No," she said. "Only honest." Edward, already dressed in his formal jacket and high collar, scowled into the mirror across the room. "I look like a corpse." "You look like a gentleman," Margaret corrected, her tone dry but warm, "which is nearly the same." She took a moment to inspect them both, the twins that had once ruled the halls of Highmore like wild things, now standing side by side with quiet solemnity. There was still mischief in them, as there always would be, but the sharp edges had softened. Not tamed exactly, but tempered. They had become steady in her presence, like vines growing toward warmth. Lionel appeared in the doorway then, already dressed in ceremonial dark wool and gloved hands clasped behind his back. He looked at his children first, then at Margaret, his expression unreadable. "Are we ready?" he asked. She nodded. They stepped out into the morning together. The carriage sent by the Queen waited just beyond the front garden gate, black and lacquered, with gold accents gleaming under the rising sun. Inside, the seats had been lined with fresh velvet, the crest of the crown embroidered above each passenger's place. The ride through the city was slow and deliberate, meant to be seen. The people of Bath stood at corners and along low stone walls, pausing their errands to watch the royal family pass. Some removed their hats. Others only stared. Lionel remained composed, nodding occasionally, his hand resting lightly atop Edward's shoulder. Margaret sat opposite him, between the children, her hands folded over her skirt. The Queen's note echoed through her mind. "She bears your name as well," though its meaning had yet to be defined. She had not spoken of it aloud. The carriage arrived at the Queen's residence, just as the bells from the Abbey struck the hour. They were ushered through a side entrance, away from the larger reception hall, and into a more private salon lined with glass-paneled bookcases and cream-colored curtains. The scent of wax and polished wood lingered faintly in the air. A steward bowed and informed them that Her Majesty would receive them shortly. They waited in stillness. Margaret stood by the window, watching the birds hop along the garden wall outside. Lionel remained seated, his fingers pressed together, his thoughts clearly far from the room. The children sat quietly for once, their eyes on the door, their hands brushing occasionally between them in silent reassurance. When the Queen finally entered, she did so without escort. She was dressed in deep sapphire, her brooch gleaming at her throat, her silver hair swept back with faultless precision. Her expression was calm, though not without gravity. Her eyes found the children first. "Eliza." "Edward," she said. Both rose to bow and curtsy. "You look quite grown today." Eliza's eyes flicked nervously toward Margaret, but she nodded. Edward bowed with more stiffness than grace. "You may sit," the Queen said gently. She turned her gaze toward Lionel, then Margaret. I requested your presence this morning not only as a formality, but as a necessity. There are matters that cannot remain uncertain, not when they affect the crown, the legacy of a noble house, and the well-being of two children caught between silence and truth. Lionel stood slowly. We are here, Your Majesty. She gestured toward the chairs before the hearth. Sit, all of you. They obeyed. The Queen remained standing. She reached into the folds of her gown and produced a sealed folder. Inside it were 2 documents, folded and marked. She placed them on the side table, then looked again at Margaret. The letter from your mother has been authenticated, she said, as has her service at Highmoor and the timeline of her dismissal. There is no dispute that she was under the household of the late Duke. There is also no doubt that your birth followed that dismissal by less than a year. Margaret remained still. No doubt. No confirmation. Indeed. The Queen moved toward the hearth. Edward de Wessex cannot defend nor deny his role, and no official acknowledgement was ever made. There is therefore no claim you may assert without a trial or scandal. But, and here she paused, her gaze steady, there are other kinds of acknowledgement. She looked to Lionel. Your Highness, do you believe this woman has brought harm or disgrace to your house? Lionel answered without hesitation. No. Do you believe she has manipulated or misled the crown? No. Do you believe she has restored dignity and order to the household of Wessex, where none had succeeded before her? Lionel looked toward Margaret, then to his children. Yes. The Queen nodded once. Very well. She turned to the children now, who sat straighter under her attention. Edward. Eliza. Do you wish Miss Wells to remain in your lives? Eliza's chin lifted. She's our Margaret. Edward leaned forward. She's part of us. The Queen's lips curved faintly. Then she lifted the second document from the table and extended it to Lionel. This is a formal declaration of appointment. It names Miss Wells as preceptress and guardian in trust to the heirs of Wessex, with full access to the children's education and welfare under the Crown's protection. It does not bestow nobility. It does not alter lineage. But it ensures her place in your house, if she will accept it. Margaret blinked once. She looked at Lionel, but his eyes were on the Queen. She has earned it, he said. The Queen extended a second page. This letter, she said, is not for public record. It contains a personal acknowledgement. From me. To her mother. It states that the Crown failed to hear her when she should have been heard. Margaret's hands trembled as she accepted the letter. Thank you, she said softly. The Queen stepped back. This audience is concluded. They rose. Edward took Margaret's hand. Eliza clutched her other. Lionel stood beside her. As they turned to leave, the Queen said one last thing. Highmoor has not felt like a home in many years. Perhaps now it will. Back at the townhouse, the children returned to their rooms under the supervision of their maid. Lionel and Margaret lingered in the drawing room, the fire still burning low. Neither spoke at first. The papers rested on the table between them. Lionel reached for them, folded them carefully, and placed them inside a leather folio. She gave you what your mother never had, he said. Margaret nodded. But not for my sake. No, for hers. They sat together in the silence that followed. After some time, Lionel leaned forward. His voice was quiet. Would you come back to Highmoor? She looked up, and for the first time in days the strain in her face eased. I never left. He didn't press further. He didn't need to. They stayed that way as the light shifted, as the fire faded, as the city outside moved on. Nothing dramatic passed between them, no promises, no declarations, only presence, only quiet, and for once it was enough. The return to Highmoor took place beneath a sky the color of warm pewter, soft with cloud but no threat of rain. The journey was quiet, no longer charged with tension, but wrapped in a silence that felt restful rather than fraught. Lionel sat beside Edward, who had fallen asleep with his head tilted against the velvet seat. Eliza leaned against Margaret's shoulder, fingers wound loosely in the fabric of her sleeve, her breathing slow and steady. The countryside passed in a haze of green fields and gray stone walls, the autumn hedgerows browning with the slow retreat of summer. Here and there, patches of wild heather still bloomed along the hillsides. The mist clung gently to the moors, as though unwilling to loosen its hold on the last days of September. By the time the carriage passed through the great gates of Highmoor, the light had turned golden, catching the west face of the castle in a glow that made the old stone seem softened, even gentle. The towers rose against the sky, familiar now, no longer imposing. Ivy climbed the corners like a silk shawl, and smoke curled from several chimneys. The house no longer looked like it had been waiting to crumble. It looked inhabited. The staff had gathered in the courtyard, not under order but instinct, their expressions composed but curious. Mr. Holling stood at the front, his posture impeccable as always, though a flicker of something like relief passed across his face when he saw Margaret step down from the carriage. She did not offer a speech, nor was one expected. She helped the children down, adjusted Eliza's cloak, and nodded once to the steward as they passed. It was Holling himself who opened the door for her. Inside, Highmoor felt both unchanged and altered. The same oil paintings watched from their dark frames, the same stone floors stretched through the halls. But the hush had shifted. It was no longer the tense, listening silence of a house ruled by ghosts, but the calm of rooms returning to life. There was laughter upstairs, thin and echoing, and the sound of hurried footsteps that didn't come from fear. The children vanished quickly toward the nursery, eager to see what had been changed during their absence. Lionel and Margaret lingered at the base of the staircase. "I had the fires lit in the west wing," he said quietly. She glanced at him. "You've reopened it? Some doors should not stay shut forever." They did not speak of the past, or of Catherine, or of letters left unanswered. There was no need. The walls had absorbed enough secrets. Let them hold silence now instead. In the days that followed, the rhythm of life at Highmoor settled into a new pattern. The twins resumed their lessons with more eagerness than before, often dragging their books into the garden or up into the old solarium, which had been cleaned and reopened by Margaret's quiet request. Servants once stationed exclusively in the main wing now crossed regularly to the nursery, exchanging gossip with those who used to keep their distance. Margaret did not resume her place as governess. That role had passed into something else, less defined, more central. She was simply there, in every room the children entered, every meal that was served, every story read before the fire. The household adjusted without ceremony. Even Holling, with his stiff collar and precise speech, no longer raised an eyebrow when she entered a room unannounced. Lionel, too, had begun to move differently. He no longer confined himself to the study or the hunting lodge. He joined Edward for walks in the orchard, played a flawed but earnest game of chess with Eliza, and spent hours in the library with a pile of estate ledgers, occasionally asking Margaret her opinion on repairs or harvest yields. He had ceased to vanish behind locked doors. One evening they dined not in the grand hall, but in the smaller dining room just off the southern gallery. Only the four of them. The fire was lit, the table set with modest silver, and the smell of roasted lamb lingered in the warm air. The children told stories about Bath, exaggerating certain details with wide eyes and dramatic gestures. Margaret listened, smiling into her wineglass. After dinner, they retired to the library. The fire was already burning. The room smelled of wax and aged leather. The wind whistled softly through the chimney, not mournfully, but like an old tune half remembered. Margaret sat on the settee, her slippers tucked beneath her, while Eliza sprawled across the rug, drawing in a small sketchbook. Edward attempted to teach Lionel a new card trick, but quickly gave up when his father confused the suits. "Hopeless," Edward muttered, but without malice. Later, after the children had been carried up to bed by their nurse, Margaret remained downstairs, watching the flames curl around the logs. Lionel poured 2 glasses of wine and brought one to her. She took it, their fingers brushing. "I've thought about asking you something," he said. She looked over at him. "But I find I don't want to ask it if it will change what we already have." Her gaze didn't falter. "Then don't ask. Just say it." Lionel sat beside her, closer than usual, but not too close. "I want you to stay. I am staying. As more than what the crown named you, more than guardian or preceptress or keeper of my unruly children." She turned her head, slow and deliberate. "I didn't think you were ready to say that." "I wasn't," he said. "But I have been ready to feel it for some time." They did not speak after that, not for several minutes. She leaned into his shoulder. His hand found hers. There was no need for declarations, no rush for promises, only warmth and weight and the soft sigh of breath between them. Outside, the wind carried the scent of burning leaves. Somewhere on the grounds, the last of the apples were falling into the orchard grass. The season was turning, but it was not bitter. And for the first time in years, the halls of Highmoor echoed not with silence, but with the sound of something beginning. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.